Peter grabbed a burning branch from the dying campfire while Jenny searched her backpack for anything that could make noise. She found an emergency flare and a small air horn, both meant for rescue signaling rather than defense. As the wolves crept closer, Jenny pulled the flare's ignition cord. A brilliant red flame exploded into the darkness, lighting the forest like daylight. The sudden flash startled the pack, forcing several wolves to retreat, but the alpha refused to move. Instead, it lowered its head and slowly continued forward. Peter swung the burning branch through the air while shouting at the top of his lungs. For several terrifying seconds, it looked as though the wolves were about to attack anyway. Then an earth-shaking roar erupted from somewhere deeper in the forest, stopping every living creature in its tracks. The wolves instantly backed away, their ears flattening against their heads before disappearing into the trees without hesitation. Jenny felt relief for only a heartbeat before realizing why they had fled. Predators do not abandon an easy meal unless something even more dangerous has entered their territory. Heavy footsteps crunched through the snow beyond the pines. Thick branches snapped one after another as an enormous shadow moved closer. Peter slowly whispered only one word: bear. Although bear encounters in snowy mountains are uncommon during the coldest months, food shortages can force hungry bears to remain active far longer than expected. The smell of their food and campfire had drawn it directly toward them. Now they faced an animal capable of killing them with a single strike. Jenny remembered one important survival rule. They could not outrun the bear, and they could not fight it. Speaking calmly, she helped Peter move backward toward a narrow rocky passage where the bear's massive body would have less room to maneuver. The towering animal finally emerged into the moonlight, its thick fur dusted with snow, its breath visible in the freezing air. It sniffed the air repeatedly before locking its eyes onto the backpacks lying beside the fire. The bear took several slow steps closer, completely ignoring the couple. Jenny quietly slid one food bag away from their shelter and tossed it several yards into the opposite direction. The bag landed with a dull thud against the snow. Instantly, the bear turned toward the sound. It ripped open the backpack, devouring the food inside while Jenny and Peter slipped silently into the rocky passage. They had escaped without a fight, but they had just lost nearly half of their remaining supplies. Believing they had finally put enough distance between themselves and the bear, the exhausted couple continued climbing through the narrow pass until they discovered the entrance to a shallow ice cave hidden beneath an overhanging cliff. It offered protection from the freezing wind and seemed like the safest place they had seen since the avalanche. Peter wanted to rest immediately, but Jenny hesitated. Strange claw marks covered the frozen walls near the entrance, and the snow inside looked unusually smooth, as though something large had recently passed through it. Before she could inspect the tracks more closely, a deep, hollow sound echoed from somewhere inside the darkness. It did not sound like the wind. It sounded like something breathing. Jenny switched off her flashlight, and the entrance of the ice cave disappeared into complete darkness. Both of them listened without moving. The slow, rhythmic sound echoed once again from deep inside the frozen tunnel. It resembled breathing, but neither of them could be certain. Peter tightened his grip on the flare gun while Jenny picked up a loose stone and threw it into the darkness. The sound bounced off the icy walls before silence returned. After nearly a minute, nothing moved. With temperatures dropping rapidly outside and the wind growing stronger by the second, they had little choice but to enter. They stepped inside cautiously, unaware that this decision would become the most dangerous mistake of their journey. The cave stretched far deeper than either of them expected. Thick walls of blue ice surrounded them, reflecting the narrow beam of Jenny's flashlight into hundreds of shimmering patterns. At first, the cave appeared empty. Then they discovered old climbing rope, a rusted cooking pot, and the remains of a small fire pit buried beneath layers of frozen ash. Someone had survived here before them. That realization brought a brief sense of hope. If another stranded hiker had once found shelter inside this cave, perhaps they could survive the night as well. But hope quickly turned into unease when Jenny noticed dozens of deep claw marks carved into the ice near the back wall. They were fresh enough that the edges had not yet frozen over. As Peter searched for dry wood near the entrance, Jenny walked farther into the cave. A narrow passage opened into a hidden chamber where cold air rushed upward through a crack in the floor. She knelt beside it and suddenly heard faint voices carried by the wind. For one unbelievable moment, she thought rescuers were calling their names. She shouted back with all her strength, but only her own voice echoed through the frozen chamber. The mountain had played a cruel trick. The opening below connected to another section of the cave, creating strange echoes that sounded almost human. As she turned to leave, she noticed enormous paw prints leading into the darkness beyond the crack. They were far larger than any wolf tracks they had seen before. Before Jenny could warn Peter, a violent roar exploded through the cave. An enormous brown bear burst from a hidden tunnel, its massive body squeezing through the narrow opening with terrifying speed. The animal had likely been using the cave as temporary shelter after being driven from lower elevations by the recent storms. Peter immediately fired the emergency flare directly toward the cave ceiling instead of at the bear. The bright explosion filled the chamber with blinding red light and deafening noise. Startled, the bear reared backward and slammed into one of the towering ice walls. The impact sent cracks racing across the ceiling like spiderwebs. Tiny pieces of ice began raining down around them. The bear fled deeper into the cave, but the danger had only grown far worse. For nearly 4 days, rescue teams searched every trail, frozen ridge, and snow-covered valley of the mountain. Helicopters circled overhead. Search dogs followed footprints that vanished beneath fresh snowfall. One by one, experienced rescuers began accepting the possibility that Jenny and Peter had not survived. A young couple, just 24 and 26 years old, had disappeared into one of the harshest mountain environments on Earth. Then something happened that no one could explain. A rescue pilot spotted a faint trail of smoke rising from a remote cliff nearly 8,000 feet above sea level. At first, everyone believed it was simply another wildfire started by lightning. But when the helicopter flew closer, the crew noticed something standing alone in the snow. It was a woman waving a torn emergency blanket with the last of her strength. Jenny was alive. Yet Peter was nowhere to be seen. What she whispered after being rescued left the entire search team in stunned silence. She did not ask for food. She did not ask for water. She looked directly at the rescuers and said, "Do not go into the cave. It is still waiting." Nobody understood what she meant. Days earlier, Jenny and Peter had arrived at the mountain expecting nothing more than a peaceful weekend surrounded by breathtaking snowy landscapes. They carried professional hiking equipment, enough food for several days, and years of outdoor experience. They believed they were prepared for anything nature could throw at them. They had absolutely no idea that within hours, the mountain would trap them in a nightmare where every decision meant the difference between life and death. And the first warning came from a sound neither of them had ever heard before. Jenny had always believed that the mountains revealed a person's true character. At 24 years old, she had spent years hiking remote trails, learning wilderness survival, and documenting breathtaking landscapes with her camera. Peter, 26, shared the same passion for adventure. Together, they had explored forests, rivers, and rocky peaks across the country, building a reputation among their friends as a couple who never backed away from a challenge. Their latest destination was Frost Peak, a remote snow-covered mountain range known for its untouched beauty and unpredictable weather. Neither of them imagined that this journey would become the greatest fight for survival of their lives. But before sunset, the mountain would begin testing them in ways they had never imagined. The forecast predicted clear skies with only light snowfall during the evening. Experienced hikers had already started descending the trails while Jenny and Peter packed their equipment into their backpacks. They carried insulated tents, emergency blankets, climbing ropes, satellite maps, first aid supplies, food for 5 days, and enough water to last until they reached the next ranger station. Every piece of equipment had been carefully checked before leaving home. They believed preparation was the key to surviving the wilderness. Unknown to them, one tiny mistake would soon make all of that preparation seem meaningless. As they climbed higher, the landscape transformed into a breathtaking world of endless white. Snow-covered pine trees stretched across the mountainsides, frozen waterfalls shimmered beneath the afternoon sunlight, and the cold air felt so pure that every breath seemed refreshing. Jenny stopped several times to capture photographs while Peter laughed and pointed toward distant mountain goats carefully crossing narrow cliffs. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. Then Jenny noticed something unusual. Every bird that had been singing only moments earlier had suddenly fallen completely silent. Peter dismissed the silence as nothing more than the changing weather, but Jenny could not shake the uneasy feeling growing inside her. She looked across the valley and noticed fresh animal tracks cutting through the snow. They were much larger than any wolf prints she had ever seen, yet there was only a single trail leading toward the dense forest ahead. Before she could study them more closely, a freezing gust of wind erased the tracks beneath fresh snow as though the mountain itself wanted to hide them. Neither of them realized they had just missed the first warning. Determined to reach their planned campsite before nightfall, they continued climbing toward a narrow ridge overlooking the valley. The temperature dropped rapidly, and thick clouds rolled across the surrounding peaks much earlier than the forecast had predicted. Peter checked his weather device, but the signal repeatedly failed to update. Even the satellite connection flickered before disappearing completely. For the first time that day, both of them understood they were completely on their own. Seconds later, a deep rumble echoed somewhere high above the mountain, and the snow beneath their boots trembled just enough to make them stop walking. Neither of them knew whether the sound came from distant thunder or something far more dangerous. Peter slowly raised his head toward the towering ridge above them. The deep rumble echoed a second time, louder than before, vibrating through the frozen ground beneath their boots. At first, it sounded like distant thunder trapped inside the mountains. Then the entire slope above them began to crack. Long fractures raced across the snowfield like lightning spreading through white glass. Jenny's face turned pale. She had seen avalanche warning videos before, but witnessing one with her own eyes was something entirely different. Within seconds, they realized the mountain itself was collapsing. They had only one chance to survive, but they had no idea if it was already too late. "Run toward the trees!" Peter shouted as loudly as he could. The peaceful silence exploded into chaos. Thousands of tons of snow broke free from the mountainside, roaring downward with terrifying speed. The sound was so powerful that it drowned out every other noise around them. Jenny sprinted across the slope as loose snow swallowed her boots with every desperate step. Peter stayed slightly behind, constantly looking over his shoulder to judge the avalanche's distance. Every second felt like a race against an unstoppable wall of white death, and it was gaining on them faster than either of them could run. They reached a cluster of massive pine trees just as the avalanche slammed into the mountainside behind them. Peter grabbed Jenny and pushed her behind the thickest tree he could find before wrapping his arms around the trunk with all his strength. The impact arrived like a freight train. Snow, broken branches, ice, and shattered rocks crashed past them with unimaginable force. Jenny could barely breathe as freezing powder buried her body. The pressure squeezed the air from her lungs while darkness surrounded her from every direction. For several endless moments, she truly believed they had been buried alive. Then everything became eerily silent. But the silence brought an even more frightening realization. Jenny forced one arm free from the snow and gasped for air. Peter was nowhere beside her. Panic surged through her as she clawed desperately at the packed snow, screaming his name until her voice echoed across the mountain. Finally, a weak cough answered from somewhere beneath a pile of broken branches. She dug with numb hands until Peter's face appeared beneath the snow. He was alive, but his right leg was trapped beneath a heavy fallen tree trunk carried down by the avalanche. Every attempt to move sent sharp pain across his face. They had survived the avalanche, but now they faced a new nightmare with no way to call for help. Working together, Jenny used their compact shovel and a sturdy climbing pole as a lever. After nearly 30 exhausting minutes, she managed to lift the trunk just enough for Peter to pull his leg free. His ankle was badly swollen, and he could barely put weight on it. The satellite communicator had been crushed during the avalanche, one backpack had vanished beneath the snow, and nearly half of their food was gone. Worse still, the avalanche had erased every visible trail leading back to safety. They were completely lost in a frozen wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction. As daylight slowly faded behind the mountains, an eerie howl drifted through the forest below. It was close enough that both of them froze without saying a single word. The howl echoed through the valley again, longer this time, followed by another from somewhere farther away. Jenny slowly turned off her flashlight, and both of them stood perfectly still, listening to the sounds drifting through the darkness. Peter knew enough about mountain wildlife to recognize what they were hearing. It was not a single wolf. It was a pack communicating across the forest. Injured, exhausted, and stranded miles from civilization, they suddenly realized they had become the weakest creatures on the mountain. Neither of them wanted to say it aloud, but both were thinking the same terrifying question. Were the wolves already tracking them? Peter's injured ankle continued to swell, making every step more painful than the last. Jenny tore a section of an emergency bandage and carefully wrapped the joint before helping him walk toward a rocky outcrop that could block the freezing wind. Together they built a small emergency shelter using a survival tarp, broken pine branches, and compact snow to insulate the walls. They knew starting a fire was risky because the smoke could attract animals, yet without one, the temperature would fall well below freezing before midnight. It was an impossible choice. Freeze in silence or risk revealing their location to whatever was moving through the forest below. Then Jenny noticed fresh paw prints leading directly toward their shelter. The tracks were enormous, far larger than those of an ordinary wolf. Each print was deeply pressed into the snow, and the distance between them suggested the animal had been moving slowly, almost as if it had been searching rather than wandering. Peter gripped a wooden hiking pole while Jenny carefully scanned the tree line with her flashlight. Nothing appeared between the snow-covered pines. For nearly 5 minutes, the forest remained completely silent. Just as they began believing the animal had moved on, 2 pale eyes reflected back from the darkness before disappearing behind the trees. Something had been watching them the entire time, and it had chosen not to attack. That decision frightened Jenny more than an immediate attack would have. The temperature continued dropping, forcing them to light a small fire using dry wood hidden beneath fallen logs. They kept the flames as low as possible, shielding the glow with rocks to avoid being seen from a distance. Peter studied their map while Jenny inventoried their remaining supplies. They had enough food for only 2 days, 1 working flashlight, limited medical supplies, and almost no way to signal for rescue. Their original hiking route no longer existed after the avalanche, leaving only one possible direction toward an abandoned ranger station marked several miles north. It was a dangerous journey even under normal conditions. With Peter injured, it could become impossible. Before either of them could decide what to do, a loud crack echoed from somewhere beneath the snow. The ground shifted just enough to knock Jenny off balance. She quickly brushed away the snow near her boots and felt her stomach tighten. Thin cracks were spreading across the frozen surface beneath their shelter. A narrow stream flowed under the snow, hidden by a fragile layer of ice that had begun weakening under the fire's heat. If the ice gave way, both of them could be swept into the freezing current below with almost no chance of survival. They immediately extinguished the fire and gathered their equipment as quickly as possible. Behind them, the ice collapsed with a deafening splash, swallowing the place where they had been sitting only seconds earlier. Relieved that they had escaped one danger, they looked toward the forest, and saw several dark figures silently moving between the trees. The wolves had finally come out of hiding. The wolves emerged one by one from the shadows, their thick gray coats blending almost perfectly with the snow-covered forest. Jenny counted 6 of them before losing sight of the others between the trees. They were not charging. They were circling. Peter immediately understood what that meant. The pack had already identified him as the weaker target because of his injured leg. The animals were patient, disciplined, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every instinct told the couple to run, but running from wolves across deep snow would only trigger a chase they could never win. Then the largest wolf stepped forward and let out a low growl that echoed through the frozen valley. The entire cavern trembled. Thick sheets of ice groaned overhead as fractures spread from wall to wall. Jenny grabbed Peter's arm and sprinted toward the entrance while chunks of ice crashed onto the cave floor behind them. They escaped just as a massive section of the ceiling collapsed, sealing the entrance beneath tons of snow and ice. The force of the collapse knocked both of them down the steep slope outside. Peter tumbled several meters before crashing into a hidden depression beneath the snow. Jenny scrambled toward him, only to discover that he had fallen into a narrow ice crevasse. He was hanging several feet below the surface, suspended only by the climbing rope wrapped around his backpack. His injured leg was bleeding badly, the rope was slowly cutting against a razor-sharp edge of ice, and every second brought it closer to snapping. Then Peter looked up at Jenny with fear in his eyes and quietly whispered, "If this rope breaks, do not try to save me." Jenny ignored Peter's desperate plea. She dropped to her knees at the edge of the crevasse and immediately anchored the remaining climbing rope around a solid boulder. Her hands shook violently from exhaustion and the freezing temperature, but she forced herself to stay focused. Every survival lesson she had ever learned came rushing back. She slowly lowered herself toward Peter, who was hanging above a black void that seemed to have no bottom. The damaged rope creaked with every movement, and tiny strands snapped one after another. Jenny knew they had only seconds before it failed completely. Then she noticed something terrifying. The ice walls beneath Peter were beginning to crack. Using the last of her strength, Jenny clipped Peter onto the second rope and shouted for him to climb. Peter fought through the unbearable pain in his injured leg, pulling himself upward one hand at a time. Just as Jenny grabbed his jacket, the original rope finally snapped and disappeared into the darkness below. Together they collapsed onto the snow, gasping for air. They had escaped death once again, but neither of them had the energy to celebrate. As dawn slowly broke across the mountain, a distant helicopter echoed through the valley. Jenny stood up and waved the final emergency blanket with everything she had left. The helicopter circled once above the ridge before disappearing behind the mountains. Once again, hope had arrived, only to vanish seconds later. Hours passed as the freezing wind grew stronger. Peter could barely remain conscious, and Jenny knew he would not survive another night without medical help. Refusing to give up, she climbed onto the highest ridge she could reach and used the cracked lens from her camera to reflect sunlight toward the distant valley. She repeated the signal over and over until her arms became numb. Nearly an hour later, a faint flash answered from the opposite mountainside. At first she believed another hiker had seen her. Then a rescue helicopter slowly emerged above the ridge and changed direction toward their location. For the first time since the avalanche, Jenny allowed herself to believe they might actually survive. But as the aircraft approached, something unexpected caught the pilot's attention. Scattered across the snow surrounding the couple were dozens of enormous paw prints. The rescue crew initially believed they belonged to a single bear. After landing, however, one experienced mountain ranger examined the tracks more closely. The prints overlapped in unusual patterns and surrounded the campsite from every direction. It appeared that the same predator had returned again and again throughout the previous 3 nights without attacking. The ranger quietly asked Jenny if she had ever seen the animal clearly. Jenny slowly nodded and pointed toward the collapsed ice cave. Then she whispered the words that would haunt every rescuer who heard them. "It never wanted us." Confused, the team followed her gaze toward the cave entrance. Nearby, half buried beneath fresh snow, they discovered the frozen remains of a mountain goat. The bear had been feeding there all along. The wolves had been tracking the bear, not the couple. Every terrifying encounter they believed had been a hunt was actually a coincidence created by overlapping survival instincts. The mountain had never been trying to kill them through some mysterious force. It had simply been an unforgiving wilderness where every creature was fighting to stay alive. Realizing how close they had come to making fatal decisions based on fear left the entire rescue team speechless. Peter underwent emergency surgery for his shattered ankle and made a full recovery after months of rehabilitation. Jenny recovered physically as well, but the experience changed both of them forever. They returned to the mountains only once, nearly a year later, not to conquer them, but to leave a small wooden marker near the valley where their fight for survival had begun. It carried a single sentence that every hiker who passed could read. "Nature is not your enemy, but it will never give you a second chance if you underestimate it." Their story spread far beyond the mountain, not because they survived an avalanche, wolves, or a starving bear, but because they survived by refusing to surrender when every reason to give up stood right in front of them. And long after the snow melted, one question continued to echo among the rescuers who had found them: how many other people had mistaken fear for the truth, and never lived long enough to discover the difference?